dark corridors of power rarely reveal their shadows at first glance. Behind the polished shields, the royal decrees, and the solemn pronouncements of medieval courts lay an unspoken truth. Women's bodies often became a battlefield for men's ambition. From palaces to parish halls, from castles to cramped dungeons, women accused of treachery or moral transgression were subjected to punishments that had less to do with justice and far more to do with political leverage. Imagine a candlelit chamber in a stone fortress. Officials lean over a parchment sealed with wax, discussing the necessary questioning of a noblewoman rumored to know too much about an unfolding plot. The language is polite, even sanctimonious, but the meaning is grim. Throughout Europe, authorities crafted systems where controlling, humiliating, or physically tormenting women could tilt the balance of power. Torture was not always the frenzied brutality of popular legend. It was often carefully staged theater, meant to intimidate rivals and reinforce hierarchies. Every scar, every shackle, every whispered threat carried political weight. To understand the darker face of medieval governance, we must examine how women were singled out when men sought dominance, not only over kingdoms but over narratives themselves. The Middle Ages were not an age of constant darkness, but they were an era where social order clung tightly to the notion that power belonged to men. Religion, law, and custom all framed women as potential disruptors of stability. Dangerous if too outspoken, threatening if too knowledgeable, scandalous if their private lives strayed from approved paths. This anxiety fed a culture where punishments could be deployed selectively, turning private accusations into public cautionary tales. When politics grew tense, whether through dynastic struggles, urban revolts, or ecclesiastical disputes, the female figure could become a convenient target. By branding her as immoral or treasonous, rulers claimed moral authority, discredited their enemies, or silenced dissent. The suffering of women thus served as both spectacle and strategy. Let us step inside that history, guided by a few emblematic stories and practices. Highborn women were not shielded from coercion. Their visibility made them tempting pawns in contests for crowns. Take the case of Isabella of Angoulême, wife of England's King John, later embroiled in the baronial upheavals that shaped Magna Carta. Though she avoided overt torture, chroniclers hinted at threats and confinements used to steer her loyalties. Elsewhere, less fortunate royal consorts endured far harsher fates. In the 14th century, Joan of Navarre, stepmother to Henry V, was accused of witchcraft during a tense political moment. Her imprisonment on dubious evidence sidelined her influence until the storm passed. Noblewomen who acted as regents or advisors risked charges of treason if their counsel displeased. A whispered claim of infidelity or sorcery could justify interrogation. Records from Burgundy and France speak of interrogations in which officials sought to force admissions, not only about personal conduct but about allies and schemes. Restraints, cold cells, and the threat of harsher measures were calculated to fracture resistance. Behind these ordeals stood an implicit bargain: denounce rivals or forfeit safety. The suffering of one woman could signal that a faction's fortunes were waning. Political punishment did not always rely on physical torment. A woman's honor was currency, and tarnishing it could be as devastating as chains. Medieval cities developed rituals of public shaming, processions, pillories, or enforced penance garments, to frame accused women as moral failures. Though often associated with petty crime or sexual scandal, such ceremonies could serve broader strategies. Consider the urban communes of Italy or the merchant towns of Flanders. When a patrician's wife or daughter was linked, rightly or wrongly, to seditious talk, magistrates might parade her through crowded squares, veiled in coarse cloth, forcing a confession scripted to align with civic agendas. The goal was rarely impartial justice. It was the consolidation of authority. By turning private misbehavior into public drama, officials reminded onlookers where power lay. Even queens felt this sting. And Bullen's downfall in Tudor England, though slightly later than the high medieval period, reflected a similar logic. Allegations of adultery and treason merged, allowing a king to remove an inconvenient spouse while reshaping court politics. Inquisitorial systems codified the use of pain as a pathway to truth. From the 13th century onward, continental law permitted judicial torture under strict, at least on paper, conditions. While men also faced this peril, women were vulnerable in unique ways. Gendered stereotypes portrayed them as deceitful or weak-willed, encouraging interrogators to apply pressure. A telling example comes from witchcraft prosecutions, which, though not exclusively political, were often entangled with local feuds or dynastic struggles. When rival factions sought to discredit a woman whose testimony might undermine them, they could push for charges of maleficium, sorcery. Under questioning, suspects endured threats of the rack or strappado, or were kept in cells where deprivation did the work of cords and pulleys. Such measures were justified as necessary to extract confessions for the good of the realm. Documentation from German territories shows how civic councils approved interrogations of women accused of poisoning wells or enchanting princes. Stories that, conveniently, aligned with the ambitions of those in power. Church institutions, too, were arenas of rivalry. Abbesses controlled property, advised monarchs, and sometimes resisted episcopal oversight. When disputes escalated, accusations of impropriety could delegitimize them. Some were confined to their convents, denied visitors, or subjected to harsh penances under the guise of spiritual correction. During the Avignon papacy, reforms around monastic discipline coincided with bitter factionalism. Women who opposed certain clerics' reforms might be portrayed as obstinate or immoral, making punitive measures seem righteous. Cloister walls concealed struggles over land, revenue, and influence, and disciplining wayward sisters provided leverage. Stories of fallen nuns, though often exaggerated, also served political narratives. Tales of hidden transgressions or illicit alliances justified interventions by bishops or secular lords. In reality, many so-called scandals masked broader disputes over who would control an abbey's wealth or allegiance. Spectacle mattered. Public punishments broadcast messages to entire communities. When a woman was marched to a scaffold or locked in an iron collar before a crowd, the intent went beyond individual chastisement. It warned others not to meddle in matters reserved for male elites. Chronicles mention women displayed in market squares for defaming their lords or meddling in politics. Some endured stocks or were tethered near courthouse doors as clerks read charges aloud. Occasionally, symbolic instruments, a broken sword for treason, a torn veil for immodesty, accompanied these scenes, reinforcing narratives of order restored. Even literary texts of the era, from chansons to morality plays, mirrored this theater, portraying ambitious women as cautionary figures who met grim ends when they overstepped. Yet not all stories end in silence. Some women resisted or used the very stage set for their humiliation to craft counter-narratives. Chroniclers record bold speeches delivered before sentencing, or letters smuggled from cells exposing the injustice behind charges. Later generations of reformers, including early humanists and legal scholars, questioned the fairness of gendered discipline. Over time, memories of politicized cruelty toward women fed movements for legal restraint. By the late Middle Ages, some jurisdictions tightened rules for evidence and limited corporal penalties, though unevenly. The shadow of earlier abuses lingered, shaping debates about sovereignty, gender, and justice. Across Europe, the later Middle Ages saw new forms of bureaucracy and law, but these advances did little to soften the fate of women caught in political storms. Instead, paperwork and procedure often disguised the same brutal aim: to bend a woman's body or reputation until it served someone else's cause. By the 15th century, royal and urban courts increasingly kept written records of trials. On parchment we find phrases such as examined under pressure or held to answer fully. Behind these neutral words lay a grim reality. When a woman's testimony threatened to upset alliances or expose corruption, interrogators used confinement, isolation, or calculated discomfort to steer her statements. In England, for instance, civic governors sometimes placed outspoken women in small, airless cells known as compters. Food was rationed, light scarce, and the prospect of indefinite detention wore down resolve. On the continent, similar tactics thrived. Municipal statutes in Flanders or the Rhineland allowed moderate constraint on those suspected of sedition. Women accused of passing messages for rebel factions were especially vulnerable. Such measures were rarely random. They were carefully applied when officials feared that a woman's words might swing public opinion or unseat a rival. Her suffering was a lever in a contest she rarely chose. Morality served as a convenient pretext for political punishment. A woman suspected of infidelity or scandal could be portrayed as unfit to speak on affairs of state, even when her alleged conduct was invented. The infamous case of Alice Pearse, companion to England's Edward III, illustrates the pattern. Chroniclers claimed she meddled in royal justice and enriched herself, but the campaigns against her were orchestrated by factions seeking control of an aging king. Alice faced confiscation of property and public humiliation. The attack on her reputation ensured that policies inconvenient to her enemies could be reversed. Elsewhere, in the city-states of northern Italy, sumptuary laws and honor codes became political weapons. Female relatives of exiled rebels might be summoned before magistrates, fined for their dress, or ordered to perform acts of penance in public chapels. These acts were framed as moral discipline but carried an unmistakable message. The state could reach into households to punish disloyalty. Periods of heresy or rebellion created fertile ground for targeting women linked, sometimes distantly, to opposition groups. During the Hussite upheavals in Bohemia, authorities questioned wives and daughters of reformers, probing for secret gatherings or correspondence. Though official manuals urged caution with the weaker sex, many records show that threats of the lash or iron chains hung over interrogations. In France, after the suppression of certain popular uprisings, royal agents focused on innkeepers, healers, or midwives suspected of carrying messages. They were sequestered in keeps or towers, pressed for names, and occasionally displayed in city gates as warnings. Their political value lay not in their supposed crimes but in their proximity to men who challenged the crown. Dynastic politics placed queens and princesses in treacherous positions. Marriages arranged to cement treaties could sour, leaving women accused of treason whenever alliances shifted. The story of Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, stands out. Accused in 1441 of sorcery against Henry VI, Eleanor was subjected to a sensational trial. Though she avoided death, she was forced to walk barefoot through London bearing a taper, a ritual meant to disgrace her husband's faction as much as herself. She spent the rest of her life confined in remote castles, a living emblem of a failed bid for influence. Similar fates befell women on the Iberian Peninsula when crowns merged or fractured. Some were sent to convents under protective custody, their communications monitored, their comfort intentionally curtailed to prevent them from bolstering rival claims. While cloisters offered sanctuary, they also served as prisons when politics demanded quiet. A princess or lady placed in a convent for reflection often endured more than spiritual retreat. Letters had to pass through censors. Visitors were screened. Diets could be meager. In some houses, rulers installed loyal abbesses to supervise inconvenient residents. During disputes between French monarchs and papal envoys, several outspoken abbesses were disciplined under the pretense of restoring monastic order. Chroniclers note that strict fasting, constant vigils, or solitary cells were imposed, penances blurred with punishment. The line between religious correction and political silencing was thin. Medieval governments understood the power of display. Executions were not the only performances staged before crowds. Shaming rituals, pillories, bridals, or symbolic costumes allowed rulers to dramatize their supremacy without resorting to outright mutilation. When directed at women tied to political intrigue, these ceremonies gained special resonance. Records from the Low Countries describe women paraded through streets with placards naming their offenses, though the real cause was often their kinship to rebels or their role as messengers. The public saw a morality play, a disorderly female brought to heel, order restored. Behind the script, power struggles played out. Even literature of the era, from moral treatises to popular ballads, reinforced these scenes, warning against meddling wives or faithless ladies who endangered kingdoms. Art and punishment worked together to teach obedience. By the late 15th century, a quieter counter-movement emerged. Legal scholars began questioning whether confessions extracted through duress could stand as evidence. Some theologians criticized the targeting of women in political quarrels, urging rulers to temper justice with mercy. In cities like Florence and Bruges, ordinances sought to limit the time prisoners could be held without trial. Nevertheless, reform was uneven. Powerful men still found ways to bend law and ritual when a woman's disgrace promised advantage. Yet cracks appeared in the edifice of unquestioned authority, preparing the way for later debates about rights and due process. Centuries later, the stories of women punished for others' gain became subjects of chronicles, plays, and romantic histories. Some narratives softened the cruelty, portraying victims as tragic heroines. Others sensationalized their suffering to caution against ambition. But hidden within these retellings lay evidence of political calculus, the careful choice of whom to accuse, how far to press, and when to display mercy. Modern research, piecing together legal roles and personal letters, allows us to see past myth to motive. What emerges is a map of influence traced on human lives, many of them female. To walk the narrow streets of a medieval town or climb the worn steps of a ruined castle is to sense echoes of these stories. Stone walls remember the women whose reputations, freedoms, and sometimes bodies were sacrificed so that men could secure crowns, councils, or clerical posts. Their ordeals were rarely accidents. They were instruments in games of supremacy. Acknowledging this history does not only recount injustice. It reveals the mechanics of power, how authority maintained itself by turning vulnerability into leverage. In studying these women's trials, we learn how politics has long sought to control narrative through control of the body, and why remembering their courage and their plight still matters today.